welcome to the Ordinary Gentleman podcast once again. I'm one of your hosts, Anton Biertje, along with Lennox Kalafungwa. And today I'd like to address the topic of Christian dating or courtship. And right at the outset, let me just say that I don't at all intend this to be an exhaustive, comprehensive look at the topic, which is a really big topic and which is probably going to be worth returning to at some point. Perhaps Lennox and I together, as we can discuss these things and give you a variety of perspectives. But I did want to just at least get the ball rolling, because this is a big part of being a man. And I've heard and read a lot on the topic of Christian dating and courtship, which is mostly very unhelpful. And the reason I say that is because when asking the question, how can a man engage in a romantic relationship with a woman in a God-honoring way, when you boil it down to the advice that's often given on the conservative side of things, the answer would really come down to, well, you just shouldn't date, which is super unhelpful. And I think it's gotten us into an unhealthy position, because the fact is that although God has blessed some individuals with the gift of singleness and the desire to live a life of service to the Lord as single men, I think those men are in the minority. And the normal pattern for life, as we see right back in the Garden of Eden, it was not good for man to be alone, and I think for the majority of us men, it's not good for us to be alone. We need a wife, and we're not going to get a wife in the Western world in our day and age unless we go out and pursue a romantic relationship with a woman and ultimately get married. And so it's a big part of being a man. It's a big part of what biblical masculinity is all about. And so I wanted to at least get the ball rolling on that topic. A lot of the time, as we start to speak about something like this, people will say from Song of Solomon, well, don't stir up or awaken love until it so pleases. And that's obviously very good advice. And so right at the outset, I think we need to acknowledge that something which makes courtship or dating for a Christian different from an unbeliever is that we never engage in a dating relationship or a romantic relationship with a woman for the sake of entertainment and sensual hedonistic pleasure. That is a one-way ticket to sin, and it is not biblical. It's also not masculine, because ultimately you're landing up using a woman in a way that God is not God honoring or honoring to her in any respect, regardless of whether or not she's on the same page as you in terms of the relationship not going anywhere. So I think this is a very important topic for men to consider, those who are serious about being biblical men. But let me just get it out right at the beginning that although we do not date in an aimless sort of way, a way that is just basically a form of entertainment, passing the time, and not every dating relationship is going to end up in marriage. I think that's just a plain fact we have to acknowledge. If we knew right out that we were going to end up with a woman, well, hey, it would probably be better just not to date at all and skip right forward to marriage. And there's obviously a couple of problems with that as well, potential problems with that. But I think on the conservative side of things, it's often that fact that we want our courtship to be purpose-driven, heading toward the goal of marriage. We want that so much that we don't actually get into a courtship unless we're 99% sure, which means that we don't get into many courtships and we end up into our late 20s and 30s not having found a spouse. So I think we just need to acknowledge that while we're aiming in a very intentional way for marriage, we're open to the possibility of things not landing up there. So marriage isn't everything, but we don't court anyone for the sake of temporary entertainment. Now, a big thing a big problem that I have with our current approach to dating and courtship is the very formal nature of the courtship, which I personally don't see in the Bible. In the Bible, we see the concept of an engagement or a betrothal, which is a formal intention to marry, and yet the couple is not yet married. But we don't really see a dating relationship or a courtship. And I think that we create a lot of problems for ourselves when we introduce these unbiblical categories. And so I prefer to look at courtship as a progression, a natural progression in a friendship which is leading toward an engagement or a betrothal. I think that often what happens is if we go from being two individuals who might be friends or might have just met each other to a couple who is dating or courting, we'll end up introducing a whole set of expectations and norms which are very unhelpful and unhealthy, and often springboard the relationship into things that it is not ready for, especially with regard to physical contact. And we'll speak a little bit more about physical contact in a courtship relationship later. Just maybe as I keep stumbling over this, I use these terms interchangeably. Dating is unfortunately something that's very worldly in its associations, but it needn't be so. Dating would be going out on dates with someone, and just implies a kind of exclusivity. Courtship is probably just a desire to be a little bit more specific in what we're speaking about. We're not just speaking about what the world does. We're doing something with the intention of getting to know someone in a way that may lead to marriage. So I'm not overly concerned about which words we use, but just a word of explanation. So yeah, I think that basically marriage is really a best friendship between a man and a woman, on fire and within the context of a covenant. And so I really think that we should get away from this formal idea of dating. I think that we should rather speak about our intentions for sure, but really view it as a natural progression from friendship to good friendship to best friends to lovers to spouses. So I just think that without the friendship stage, you often land up getting thrown right into the deep end, and this leads to one of two undesirable outcomes. The one is that you go too far too fast, and it becomes a point of, well, we're beyond the point of no return. We can see this is not really working out, but we'll just get married anyway. Or we make ourselves terribly uncomfortable, and something which could have worked as a wonderful marriage never gets the opportunity because we scare each other off. And I think this is something where we as men need to be very sensitive to the lady in the relationship, in that if she is a godly woman who has been brought up, especially in a conservative setting, she may be easily scared off because of uncharted territory. And I think we need to be very sensitive to that, and not risk destroying what could be a wonderful marriage just because we're moving too quickly. So yeah, I think it really should be a natural progression, and we want to try and avoid some cultural pitfalls in terms of the expectations associated with dating. So I don't think that people who are dating or who are courting need to feel any pressure to be holding hands on dates, or to be kissing, or to be hugging, or to be doing anything. I think these things ought to be allowed to come naturally as the relationship progresses. And I think that ultimately that leads toward marriage. A marriage which is based on a friendship, which is far more robust than a mutual agreement based on, hey, would you like to go out with me? That's not to say that we don't set expectations. That's not to say that we don't communicate our intentions. That is something which a man really needs to take the lead in, especially with a lady who is wondering, what is this guy's intentions with me? We need to be very, we need to give some thought into, we don't want to be leading a lady on, and we also don't want to be leaving her hanging, where things are clear in our minds, but she would like a little bit more clear. We do need to be speaking about our intentions. But at the end of the day, I think the time for announcing things to the world comes with the formal engagement, and I just get that from the biblical pattern. So yeah, there it is. You might not agree with me, but I just think that the formal idea of dating probably introduces more problems than it solves. So, parental approval. I think this is another very important thing for us as men to consider, because as a man who's pursuing a woman for the sake of marrying her, you are essentially desiring to, among other things, become her authority before God. And if you're going to take that seriously, you really need to take seriously the authority that is in her life currently, which is her father. And this is a bit of a tricky thing to deal with, especially if her father's an unbeliever. But I think it's something really worth investing some time and thought into, and I think it's very helpful to speak to whoever you are dating about this and about her father's expectations. I really think that you need to involve him and give him an idea of your intentions with his daughter as early as possible. Having said that, again, we don't want to necessarily go and undo what I was saying in the previous point about an overly formal dating relationship, which ultimately might not end in marriage. So it's going to take some wisdom and some thought, but that's life, right? So I really think it's worth us thinking through this and being courageous. Go and speak to her dad. Get to know her dad. It's going to be something which is going to stand you in very good stead for the future. Having said that, how you do that is I think going to vary. At the end of the day, you're not asking for a hand in marriage yet. That's going to come later. But I do think that you want to acknowledge her current authority, which is her father, and just take that into account. How do you deal with it if she doesn't have a father? Well, that's going to be probably a whole nother conversation. Nevertheless, I think whoever her authority figures are, at that point, you need to try and get them on board. So, the physical side of things. As a man, you not only have to take the lead here because you are because you're a man and you're ultimately called to take the lead in the rest of life, but you're going to need to be the one setting the temperature here, because you are the one most likely who's going to be the most tempted. And so it's something that you also can't just allow to happen. You need to be giving some serious forethought to physical contact and the like. And so I think that there are general rules or general principles laid down in Scripture in terms of those things which are reserved for marriage, which we hardly need to speak about at this stage, in terms of we don't engage in any sexual activity prior to marriage. But I do think that there is a tension between two things here. Number one, we want to recognize that there is a natural progression to a relationship, especially in our context. in terms of what I was speaking about earlier, there are degrees of friendship, and in the same way, I think there's degrees of a romantic relationship. And personally, I think that it is quite helpful for a man to be sensitive not only to his wife's emotional needs, but also to her acclimatization to the physical side of a relationship, especially if she's coming from a very conservative background. I think personally, to go from 0 to all the way on the marriage night is quite a big deal, and I think that's asking a lot from a conservative girl who's seeking to honor the Lord. So personally, I think that there ought to be a natural progression in terms of the degrees of physical contact, and yet I'm speaking to men here. We really need to guard against going too far. And it's one of those things which it's a lot easier to maintain a conservative break on things than it is to go too far and have to come back because of the law of diminishing returns. Just realize that those butterflies that you felt holding your hand today, in a week, 2 weeks, a month's time, those are not going to be there, and you're going to be looking for more. So just bear that in mind. And even with regard to approaching a dating relationship, I should have said this back in the beginning, we don't want to initiate a courtship until we're in a position or reasonably close to being in a position where we're able to get married. Whatever that's going to look like, I think that the Bible speaks about a man being able to support his spouse. That would be financially as well as in other areas. So we don't want to initiate until we're at that point. But for some people, things are going to happen with a fair amount of time prior to being able to get married. And we want to make sure that we pace ourselves, because we don't want to dishonor the Lord as we go too far. So I think that while we don't want to go too far, I do think that we want to be natural in the progression of things, and that's going to look different for different people. I think this is something you need to be constantly communicating with your romantic partner about, in terms of how you're feeling, and setting some boundaries right at the outset. It's a difficult one, and I'd be happy to answer some specific questions, but it is one in which I have regrets, and I think that to err on the side of caution is going to be something which you're going to feel a whole lot better about before the Lord, ultimately, than it is to go too far and regret that. And thankfully, the Lord can forgive us of these sins, and yet I think any serious man, serious about his relationship with the Lord, doesn't want to get into those situations at all from the outset. Realize also that you're not going to make good decisions in the heat of the moment, so you need to be thinking about these things and setting boundaries for yourself when you're not in the heat of the moment. Okay. The actual dates. Just a couple of things. This is going to be very different from person to person. This is something where you want to take the lead, where you want to show initiative, where you want to put some thought and effort into it, put your back into it. And this is something which I would like to encourage men to be thinking about in terms of a lifestyle. This is not something which you do to win the girl and then it's all over. This is something which you're going to want to continue throughout your married life. So think of it in that way. That's not the way I thought of it, and yet I think it's a better way of doing it. I would just a couple of suggestions. I would avoid seclusion because of the physical side of things and the temptations that come along with that. But I would also be looking for opportunities to get to know my future wife. So movies, in my opinion, are not the greatest. It's not a bad dating idea, but you don't want to be only going to movies. You don't want to only be going to loud places where you can't have a conversation. I think you really want to be seeking to get to know your spouse. The Bible speaks about living with your wife in an understanding way. And I think you can start that even before marriage. So you want to get to know her. So go for picnics, go for walks, go out for coffee, get together with other friends as well. It's always good to interact with your spouse or with your future spouse in a group. You get to see how they interact with other people, and you learn things about them which you might not learn if you're only ever with them alone. And it also gives opportunity for you to live out your courtship before the Lord in terms of doing Bible studies together, praying together, discussing your future together in terms of what your expectations are with regard to parenting, with regard to certain doctrinal issues, with regard to career and finances and all of those sort of things. I think you want to have opportunity, you want to make opportunity to speak together, to communicate. This is not only wise, I think this is also a good precedent for the rest of married life. Again, once you're married, it may feel like the finish line. It's really not. You're only now in the race. So just bear that in mind and establish good patterns even now. If we go with, maybe let me speak about communication first. So I think friendships and by extension dating relationships are all based on communication. And we as men are often not terribly good at that. And what we don't want is we don't want to have a straw man or a straw woman of a partner based on infatuation. We want to actually get to know them. And I've noticed that a large majority of fights and problems in relationships arise out of misunderstandings or a lack of communication or leaving things until they become big things and then blow up. And so in my dating relationship with my wife, we resolved to always speak about everything as early as possible, even if it was really small. This way we just felt that we minimized the risk of misunderstanding and molehills turning into mountains further down the road. It also allows for mutual submission and service toward one another as we understand better what each other is desiring. And it's gonna require a commitment from both of you to not take criticism personally and to be willing to rethink and work through any topic which lands up coming up. True love, we know from Corinthians, doesn't insist on its own way. And I think fights are arising commonly. If fights are arising commonly because one or both of you are refusing to budge on an issue, then it might be worth looking at the whole premise of the relationship to begin with. So yeah, communication is extremely, extremely important. How do you answer those if you've made the decision not to formalize the dating relationship in terms of all the expectations that come with it? Now I'm putting it on Facebook, in a relationship. How do you answer the questions that come from others? Are you dating? And here I think when you're speaking to other Christians, you can elaborate a little bit more about your intentions and about your approach to things in terms of not wanting to put a whole bunch of unbiblical expectations on one another. But when you're speaking to unbelievers, I think sometimes it's a lot easier just to give them an answer and say, yes, we're dating. In terms of the way they think about dating, we're dating. Having discussed a whole bunch of things now about the relationship itself, I would just like to throw in here the fact that you need to make time to see your friends as individuals apart from one another. Not only because this is good for you. As men, we still need to be interacting with men. Our partners need to be interacting with other women. That's going to be good for her, and it's going to be good for us to spend some time with friends alone. It's also good for our friends, who we are showing that just because we're now this other person has come into our lives as the most important friend that we have, it doesn't mean that we're undervaluing or overlooking our other friends, because you're going to need them. And when the fade to normal comes, and it's going to come, you're going to want your friends, because the fact is that we haven't just been made for marriage. We've been made for community. And so that fade to normal is going to come, and you don't want to have lost your friends in the process. Unfortunately, something which seems to happen fairly commonly. So just with regard to that fade to normal, just realize that no matter how hard you try and keep those butterflies in your stomach and that feeling of magic and romance, there is an inevitable familiarization that's going to happen between you and your partner, which is in one sense something which we ought to fight against, but in another sense it's completely normal and natural in our relationships. So as I mentioned earlier, holding hands once used to thrill you, and after a while you find that it's making your hands sweaty. You used to put your arm around her during the whole movie, even though you stopped feeling your arm about 20 minutes in. And later on you're like, nah, I value the feeling in my hand. And I think that's normal. But we do want to try and keep fanning those sparks into flame throughout life. Yeah. Remember that your partner is on their best behavior during your dating relationship. And so if they're extra irritating and irksome during the dating relationship, if you're having a lot of arguments during your dating relationship, realize that because of this fade to normal, things are not going to get better just because you're married now. They're probably going to get worse. So just realize that this is both positive and negative. Negative in the sense that those feelings of romance are going to diminish, but positive in the sense that this is a very good gauge of what marriage is going to be like. This is a training ground for marriage, and so marriage is not suddenly going to change everything. Things are going to, what irritates you now is going to irritate you more in the future, probably. The last thing I want to say at this point, and again, this is by no means an exhaustive conversation on the topic, but just to get the ball rolling. But the last thing I think I'd like to say on the topic is just to be careful of idolizing your partner, and to be careful of overdoing it. Proverbs 25:17 says, "Let your foot be seldom in your neighbor's house, lest he have his fill of you and hate you." And I think this is wise advice, and there's application for us in the dating and courtship relationship as well. And dating someone to the glory of God is not a simple thing. It's not easy, and yet it is something we really need to be striving for, because things of value seldom come easily, and a marriage is something which is of great value, and I think that it is something we need to be pursuing as men, and that's going to happen in our culture through the dating relationship. So be praying about it much, be communicating much, recognize the authority in your partner's life, acknowledge them, involve them, and depend on God's aid during a relationship, realizing that whatever you're doing now, you are setting the foundation, you're setting a precedent for the future. So don't think of this as some strange time which is just going to magically be normalized later in marriage. Really, what you're experiencing now is good friendship prior to making of covenants. Afterwards, you're going to be building on the foundation that you laid in terms of your friendship with this person here and now. But the process, I think, is well worth the effort. So if you have any questions, please let me know. You can put them in the comments below or send me an email. But until then, at least we've gotten this conversation started, and may the Lord find us faithful as we seek to be godly men.